Keir Giles has spent his career watching, studying, and explaining Russia. Keir's work has appeared in a wide range of academic and military publications across Europe and in North America, and he is a regular contributor and commentator on Russian affairs for international print and broadcast media. He's written multiple books on the geopolitical conflict between the West and Russia. That includes NATO's Handbook of Russian Information Warfare, published through the NATO Defense College. He is a regular contributor to research projects on Russian security issues in the US, UK, and Europe, and hopefully he will be familiar from his works and, of course, his appearances on this channel to the audience. Keir, I'm delighted to welcome you back.
Hello again, Jonathan. Yes, as you just mentioned, I seem to have spent a very long time trying to explain Russia, but it never really quite gets through.
It is. I mean, and it's not quite the sort of enigma wrapped in a question mark, etc., that Churchill said. I think there's some of the core ideas that you try to elucidate are not, they're not dramatically complex to grasp, and yet, how do you explain that we seem to have a sort of goldfish approach to this, endlessly resetting and not understanding, let's say, the malign intent of Russia through the centuries?
Well, that's a question that we've grappled with obviously over years and decades, and wondering why there's this constant return to an idea of Russia which is remote from the reality. And there are several different reasons that are driving this. In part, it is just a functional reason. For so long, we had a churn of people dealing with Russia in whatever field it might be, whether it's government or military or business, who would come in full of ideas about how to deal with the Russia problem and think that they would solve it because they were special and all of their predecessors had been unable to work with Russia because they were not special. Then they learn during the course of their 2 or 3 year posting or whatever it might be, when they're dealing with the Russia problem, they become educated through disappointment as to exactly how you can and cannot work with Moscow. Trouble is, by the time they have acquired that knowledge, it's time for them to shuffle on to a new bureaucratic post elsewhere, and so the cycle begins again. That's one problem. The other problem, of course, is that so many people have come to dealing with Russia from a background which is entirely unsuited and entirely different from that problem set. If you have a European bureaucrat, for example, his education, his formative experiences, his diplomatic career, all of the ways in which he's worked with other countries within, for example, the EU, are completely irrelevant when he's faced with a country which exercises statecraft in a completely different way and approaches international problems in an entirely different manner from what he's used to. So there's a lot of unlearning that has to be done of the normal and natural way to do business as they see it, and a lot of new learning of how to deal with a country which is operating not just from outside our geographic space, but from outside our century. And that process too takes time, it takes disappointment. You need that radicalization by disappointment that we've seen people who've been in post for long enough go through. For example, the classic case being Emmanuel Macron, starting off wanting to build bridges with Russia, a partnership with Russia to govern Europe, and then eventually understanding that no, Russia is the threat to Europe rather than a partner, and therefore Macron becoming one of the foremost spokespeople for taking a line with Russia which will defend Europe as opposed to leaving it exposed.
Dare I say it, quite a few people who've been in post in Russia as well get rather plush tickets to the Bolshoi as well. And there's a certain, let's say, sort of maybe cultural corruption that goes on there as well that sort of blinkers people. We won't go dive into that, but I wanted to go back to what I think is one of the most important books to understand the behavior of Moscow, and that is your book, Moscow Rules, a textbook example. Well, is what we're seeing now a textbook example of the maximalist and coercive negotiation techniques that you outlined in Moscow Rules?
It would be if it weren't for the fact that the negotiating partner of Russia, the United States, is not engaging in a competition, but instead appears perfectly happy to roll over and accept whatever Russia dictates. This is not a situation where it is pitting diplomatic skills against each other in a battle of wits. If it is a battle of wits, then one side appears to be turning up completely unarmed. So it's not those classic cases where European diplomats, for example, are confused by the fact that rather than looking for a win-win outcome, Russia is looking for a zero-sum solution and a possibly even a lose-lose outcome where they're content if you lose more than they do. What we have here is a different situation that's come from an entirely different source. And instead it is the capture of the thinking part of the United States administration by Russian ideas and that ideological sympathy with Moscow that's come through in the new national security strategy.
And there's a couple of angles that come off that. One is the misalignment between Putin's motivations and his aspirations, and that of Trump. And I'm interested to hear your view here because I think there's a genuine misalignment. We call Trump transactional, but even in his sort of, gangster style, there is some, I would say, it's economic rationality, even if it's entirely egotistical and gangster driven. He seems to expect Putin to also be motivated by crooked deals, resources, money, etc. It seems, though, that at this stage in his regime, Putin has more money than God. He's not interested in wealth. He's interested in entirely different things, different values, even. Do you perceive this misalignment?
I think it might be misleading to call it a misalignment because, of course, on the basic structure of the world and how the world should work and how it should be divided between these spheres of influence, they seem to be entirely in sympathy. And we've seen Russia welcome the new US national security strategy, saying this aligns with our thinking, which ought to be a big flashing danger signal for the United States, not to mention, of course, its allies. But instead, it's not a problem because these ideological views of the world are very much in sympathy. When it comes to the commercial angle that you're saying, it's a very one-sided process. This is something which Russia has used to seduce the United States into attempting to enforce its surrender terms on Ukraine by dangling the prospect of lucrative deals. And the United States is and those who are willing to sign up to these in order to end the day richer than they started it, are also prepared to ignore all of the bitter past experience of people who've been seduced by Russia in this manner before, only to lose their entire investment.
No, I had a rather curious debate recently. I'm not sure the efficacy of actually joining these, but it was one of these panels where they posit, one of the, I would say, mouthpieces or propagandists of the Kremlin against pro-Ukrainians. It just so happens that it's run by a crypto kind of guy who is close to Elon Musk. So I think that tells you something about the overall intent. My thinking was that if I don't take part, then this will be run by somebody maybe less effective. But I debated a chap who I'm sure you're familiar with called Glenn Deason. Yes, rather a disingenuous, etc. Character, and of course he is echoing Russian talking points, and it exclusively focuses on external matters. It's NATO's fault. It's this. It's that. It's Ukrainian Nazis. Blah blah blah. When I was speaking to a Ukrainian intelligence officer, he says, look, you have to understand that a lot of what Moscow is doing relates more to its internal politics and the, let's say, requirements and paranoia of the regime vis-a-vis maintaining power internally. What's your view as to that sort of external versus internal dynamic or objectives behind Russian policies?
I think we shouldn't overstate the role of internal politics in driving what Russia does abroad. There used to be a fashionable theory that Russia sought external adventures in order to distract the population at home from the problems internally, and that without that, the regime was not able to sustain itself because it needed the prestige of successful short foreign wars in order to keep itself afloat. I think that was overdone. And I think it overlooked the reasons why Putin and those who support him go to war in the first place, and the fact that these were not in cycle with the times when Russia was under a certain amount of domestic pressure. There is this mainspring of Russian behavior which follows this messianic vision of regaining the empire, which isn't subject to these internal twists and turns of the economy, of popular sentiment, whatever it may be. So for the time being, there's nothing to prevent Russia from continuing its war because it does not feel that kind of pressure at home. And indeed, all of the popular support that we see for Russia continuing its genocidal campaigns doesn't give any indication that there's any reason for them to stop anytime soon.
And of course, this messianic trend, for those who sort of pay attention to this, concepts of the Third Rome, etc., etc. This seems, in a very shocking way, to be reflected. Partly, it's a distorted reflection, but reflected in the national security policy of the United States. It talks about Europe being decadent. It uses a extreme right-wing theory of replacement of ethnically white Christian Europeans, etc. It takes those sort of weaponized narratives, but this very much aligns with the narratives that have been coming out of the Kremlin. Certainly since 2014, possibly sort of embedded in people like Dugin prior to that. How is this a form of sort of alignment there? And what might come of this, I would say, weaponization of the European space?
Well, there is a lot of alignment there. There are a lot of things that are very much in sympathy with how Russia views the world, and that's the reason why Russia has welcomed this view that is laid out in the national security strategy. Which is not to say that everything in there comes from Russia. A lot of this is homegrown, and a lot of this is not as wild and outlandish as some people have described it in Europe. It is simply not what people in Europe are accustomed to hearing, partly because of the point that's also made in the national security strategy that there is a restriction on what you can say about the current situation in Europe. It talks about the limitations on freedom of expression and mentioning, as the national security strategy does, that there are European societies which are in danger of, as they put it, civilizational erasure as a result of uncontrolled migration and fundamentally transforming their societies is not something you're really allowed to talk about in Europe, which underlines their point. So there is some basis in what they're describing that is not so distant from reality, but it's distant from the reality as it is portrayed by those European elites that they are so critical of. Now, where it's fundamentally wrong, of course, is suggesting that the primary threat to Europe is not Russia, but it is those same Euro elites. And, of course, all of the civil society and democracy promotion campaigns that the United States used to direct towards authoritarian regimes, they're now talking about directing against liberal democracies where they see the democratic elite, or rather the undemocratic elite, being out of kilter and out of sync with what the majority of the population understands and believes and their lived experience. And of course, we have pretty dramatic examples of that mismatch and how it happens. The Brexit vote, for example, give British voters an actual genuine democratic vote as opposed to the parliamentary system, and don't be surprised if they vote for something which they want, which is a huge surprise to that ruling elite.
By it has to be said, a small majority, and quite a few have recanted from that point of view since. But that's an interesting point, isn't it? It's that 2016 seems to be the point at which we started heading into this new world with the sort of breakdown of the so-called international rules-based order, etc., etc. That's the starting gun, it seems, for that. You have to excuse my sort of soft liberal idea that the only transformational processes possible are through democratic institutions. But that's not what the national security policy is saying here. There seems to be a very clear targeting of what it sees as European institutions as becoming the enemy, not Russia itself. It doesn't talk about tackling dictatorships and kleptocrats, which again are an extraordinary force for eroding and reducing sort of freedoms, dare I say, and innovation as well. And this seems to set itself against institutions that actually are the barrier to Russian aggression and penetration of the continent. It seems to set its sights on degrading them. We'll come to the implications of that soon. Is that how you're reading it as well? You know, kleptocrats good, democratic institutions bad.
Well, let's start with where you started. The idea that transformation is only possible through democratic institutions. That, forgive me, Jonathan, is nonsense. Because that is simply not true. And let's look at what's happening in the United States. It's a process of authoritarian state capture that mimics other processes that we see in, for example, Russia at the beginning of this century, Germany in the 1930s, which have nothing to do with democracy and yet bring about fundamental political and social change. This is what is happening now, and the endorsement of uh, kleptocracy and a very small ruling elite that funnels all of the national wealth into their own pockets is not a new idea. But yes, it is something which is fully embraced by the current Trump administration, and apparently with no safeguards to prevent this happening. So the world vision that is laid out in this national security strategy is not something which is a complete fantasy. It is entirely achievable, and the United States is working hard towards this, as is Russia.
Yeah, so I'll go against my own point in that Ukrainian civic society also shows that you have to work through these, you know, large and democratic institutions. You can work as a sort of civic pressure to change things as well. Um, This charter also, now many in the media have described it as an isolationist document. That's not how it struck me. It seemed that it's very interventionist, that it actually creates a charter or a mandate for regime change in Europe. And of course, we've got the language of civilization decline, etc., that nominally sort of justifies that. We also are aware that in the background there is a sort of, let's say, tech fascist Project 25, Peter Thiel, Yavin kind of thing in the background with the sort of grinning visage of Bannon, supposedly behind quite a bit of this. Do you see this as isolationist or interventionist in character?
Well, I don't think it's an either-or question. It's certainly isolationist compared to what had previously been taken for granted in US national strategy, which is that you need these strong relationships that support stability in your allies around the world, not just in Europe, but also in East Asia. Now, instead, it's talking about a retreat to hemispheric defense and leaving the allies to their own devices. But it's also interventionist in that those allies need to be guided to the correct course, as it is understood by the United States. Hence, the the promise of intervention to support the publics, what the broad publics across Europe want, as opposed to what's being imposed on them by these isolated and out of touch elites that are imposing the EU's ideologies. So they're both happening at the same time. It's a fundamentally different world vision and something completely new in both of those directions.
And there is a fundamental flaw, it seems, in the entire strategy. Now, of course, it's built on the idea of business deals, not shared principles. I think you've mentioned things like this in many of your recent interviews. But it also takes an idea that has essentially failed in China, which is that through building economic relationships, you can somehow bring a country on the path to democracy. And of course, China started that and has now sort of reversed that course. But it's taken that same failed and flawed idea that somehow you can bring Russia on side by trade deals, etc.
I may have missed the part where it talks about bringing democracy to Russia. Where does it say
Oh,
that they want to bring democracy to Russia? I
oh,
don't
right.
recall that.
No, it absolutely doesn't. And there's no mention of democracy and values there.
Good.
But when
Okay,
you
I'm not. It's not me losing my mind then.
certainly
No, the kind of democracy that this document is talking about bringing is fundamentally different from the kind of democracy that European elites think that they enjoy and think and have been profiting from for all this time. It is something entirely different, and that is where so many people across Europe have found this a threatening document because it threatens to upend the system which they believe works for them.
And this, of course, really puts the onus back onto Europe. And I think one of the titles I nominally gave to this was, "Is Europe going to finally wake up, or is it again going to hit the snooze button?"
I
This
think we've
seems,
done that a few times before, haven't we? We've had
yes,
conversations with that title. Is this finally the
we
wake-up call
have.
that Europe will listen to? I think the number of times we've done
The
that is an
last 2 years,
indication that
Keir,
they'll
in fact.
probably snooze on.
But it seems to me the stakes are high here, and I'm going to outline a scenario. Now, I know for historians, it's not necessarily the best thing to say, well, what is going to happen in the next few years? But if we look at Russia's strategic approach, and in the Cold War, the way the Warsaw Pact functioned, now, of course, it's no longer pushing communist ideology. It's no longer got exactly the same kind of impetus. But what I fear here is that what Russia is seeking to do, and it now has the US essentially on its side in this project, which is to erode the institutions that provide a bulwark against Russian expansion. Traditionally, that's EU, NATO, and the alliance with the US. In a future world, you could have Russia picking off states to create compliant regimes or to ally with compliant regimes and kleptocrats such as Orban to create a very vulnerable, weak mosaic of European states, which essentially allows the European continent to become the de facto sphere of influence of Russia. Are we heading towards such a scenario?
Well, I think we're already quite a long way down that track. This is, after all, the idea that lay behind these consistent Russian proposals for a so-called new European security architecture, which, if you look at it closely, was the old European security architecture, the Russian and now American comfort zone of the great powers deciding spheres of influence between them, and the countries in between not having much of a say in which sphere they belong to. That is well advanced now, and as you mentioned, the US now being on the side will give this a substantial impetus. Because if there is that US disengagement from European security and European defense, that does leave the door wide open for Russia to pursue its own projects. And that, of course, is one of the unifying factors that we've seen across the actions of the Trump administration, and especially in those very chaotic, it seemed, early few months, the first few months of Trump's arrival, and taking the fire axe to US institutions with the aid of Elon Musk. What was the common factor about all of the things they were destroying? It was the things that were obstacles to Russian power, whether it is US instruments of soft power around the world, like USAID, like RFERL, like the State Department, or indeed the intelligence part of the State Department that it was focused on Russia, or the defenses of the United States at home, things to protect the United States against foreign influence, against disinformation, against cyber attacks, extremism, etc., all of which leave the field wide open for not just Russia, but also China, Iran, anybody that wants to spread into that space that formerly was occupied by the United States or to threaten the US at home, now has a very much easier job. So what remains is US hard power, that presence of forces around the world, where we've seen the national security strategy. What we haven't seen yet is the global force posture review, where they may explain how they want to implement that national security strategy. And that's what Europe and also US allies around the world, particularly in East Asia, should be watching for closely now to see if the do is going to match the say.
And of course, they have unilaterally started to withdraw some forces. I believe Romania had US forces removed in a surprise kind of maneuver there. But it's not a sort of clear cut, is it? I believe a bunch of armored vehicles have been gifted to Poland. At the moment, it's still giving those sort of mixed signals. But could we see a wholesale withdrawal of US hard power from the European continent?
Well, that's long been promised, and as you say, what we have so far is tinkering around the edges. It's bringing forward rotations. It is still some programs continuing under their own impetus. That may be because we haven't had the spotlight of administration attention coming around to this issue in quite the same way as it has on others. Or it may simply be that the inertia within the system means it's going to take time for these orders to be generated. All of that means that for the time being, US forces are still present in Europe. The US postings to organizations like NATO are still in effect. The system is still working because nobody has actually told it to stop. So we may be in for a surprise. It may be correct what Reuters has reported before the weekend, that Europe has been given a deadline of 2027 to get its act together and be able to replace some of these key US capabilities. We simply don't know unless and until it actually finally happens, and that may be the first moment at which we get an indication of what the United States plans really are.
That reminds me a little bit of a J.G. Ballard short story, I think, after a nuclear apocalypse where all the household robots carry on with their tasks, even though the people are no longer present. NATO, how far is it, let's say, a zombie institution? Because we have talked about this as well. And as you say, it's giving a good impression of still being a functional alliance, but it hasn't come under a full kinetic test. It's coming under increasing hybrid tests, and I would say visibly failing in that. We had combat drones potentially about to intersect Zelensky's plane in Ireland. Now, Ireland, of course, isn't a member of NATO, but I think the same failings to tackle Russian hybrid warfare don't bode well for our response to a full kinetic incursion if that were to happen.
Well, there's been a long overdue new development in NATO as well in the course of the last week, which might have got a little bit submerged in all of the news that's been happening, where NATO is finally talking in terms of being proactive in dealing with Russia, as opposed to simply being passive, as opposed to just being a punch bag for all of these different kinds of attacks that Russia has been carrying out across the European continent. There's been some kind of authorization for language about engaging in a deterrent conversation with Russia and saying, if this continues, things will happen to Russia that it will not like. Now, what we can't see yet is whether that's going to be followed through with action or if it is just NATO once again engaging in brave words which don't always connect with reality. But it is at least promising that the permission has been given for this to happen. Let's wait and see.
They would perhaps have a little more weight if Europe would stop buying Russian LNG and processed oil products that come via India. But that's another question. And then there's the frozen assets. But again, let's not jump into that. We had a good conversation with Timothy Ash on that one recently. I'm going to put forward rather a terrifying scenario, and please do tell me if I'm being alarmist. What we've seen in Chechnya and what we've seen in Donbass is that once Russia conquers or infiltrates a particular territory, it turns that population against their own people. They become cannon fodder for the next war to take the next territory and the next. In this future mosaic scenario of Europe where institutions have degraded, and you have Kremlin-aligned kleptocrats and a few democracies holding on, at least until the next election, and a constant threat of hybrid war to undermine their societies, could you not also see the start of that process where Moscow starts to weaponize the populations of some territories and compliant territories and throw them at the others to try and accelerate this process? As I say, a sort of Warsaw Pact type gangster agreement for the 21st century.
Well, this isn't at all a controversial scenario. This is standard practice for Moscow. This is what we see not just in the examples you gave from the current century, but also in the previous century, in fact, throughout Russian history. This is how Russia operates. So we should anticipate that this will happen in that world environment you're describing.
Oh, I'm glad you didn't see that as controversial then, because that's something I certainly do fear here. What should we be doing then? Let's turn in the last couple of minutes we've got, because this snooze button keeps being hit, and yet the threat becomes ever more existential. And indeed, we are stretching Ukraine's resilience. And when we use that word without following up with action, it is not helpful. It is, I think, something of an insult to Ukraine's sacrifice and bravery. But we are stretching their resilience to breaking point and not giving them the resources that they need, not just to fight and survive, but to even plug the gaps in their budget, which are clearly going to open up. Are we going to stretch this to the point where essentially we bring the house down?
Well, that seems to be the pattern so far. There hasn't been anything which has convinced European leaders that they need to step in and fill that gap in order to protect themselves. Again, there's lip service paid to this. There is the idea that is now more widely accepted that Ukraine is the front line of the defense of Europe, but it's not followed through with the action. You still have the EU saying that it's fully committed to Ukrainian territorial integrity and sovereignty, but not following through with the logical step that follows from that, because anybody that is fully committed is backing Ukraine and is present on the front lines. So again, there's the mismatch between the brave words and the action that follows through, and we are constantly now having conversations, have been for the last 2 to 3 years, about what it would take for European countries, including most egregiously the UK, to actually recognize the urgency of the situation now and do something about it. The conclusion we usually arrive at is that it will take some undeniable disaster that causes substantial numbers of casualties in one or more European countries beyond Ukraine to actually focus minds on the problem and how to deal with it.
Quite unlike, I mean, despite Chamberlain and the word Chamberlain being thrown around, we were furiously rearming, I think, in those years of appeasement, which we are not at the moment. And another narrative, this is the very, very last thing, but I want to touch upon your knowledge of the defence review that we had, and indeed part of the military-industrial complex. A friend of mine who is a venture capitalist and investor in drone tech in Kiev on behalf of international investors, told me of a troubling narrative doing the rounds in Western capitals, and that is that, well, of course, Ukraine is good at drone warfare, and of course, it's highly relevant to their survival. But that's just very specific. That's very regional. When this war is over, yeah, those lessons aren't really going to be so important to us, and we can go back to building our large, high-margin, shiny platforms, and everything will return to normal. Maybe I've mischaracterized it, but that seems to be the general conversation there, that there are not these dramatic lessons to learn. However, it seems to me from talking extensively to Ukrainian service people, including many in Azov and the Third Assault Corps, Russia obviously has a mass of cannon fodder, but it also has patches of excellence, as it did in the Soviet Union. And some of those are elite drone units, which next to Ukraine are some of the best in the world. This ought to terrify us, but rather this narrative talks of incredible hubris and ignorance.
Well, I think it's one of those situations where we shouldn't generalize about the whole of Europe. Because just as in being ready for the threat, being responsive to what we see developing in Ukraine and recognizing what this means for our own preparedness and our own readiness for the kind of warfare that Russia wages is likely to vary across the continent. Some countries will take this very seriously and be ready for it. Others will still think that they are cozy in their readiness a la 20th century. Speaking from a UK perspective, we occasionally speak to bits of the British Army about this and that, and I can tell you that the lessons from Ukraine are being absorbed as rapidly as possible and are being acted on as rapidly as possible within the constraints of a government that is refusing still to fund defense or taking it seriously. So people are watching this. People are understanding the relevance to their own future task in withstanding Russia, but it's probably a multi-speed process across Europe, and the UK would do more if it had a government that was willing to take an interest in defense.
Here, that's where we're going to have to end it. I know the calls upon your time are legion at the moment in this inflection point, and of course, things you've been predicting for many years are coming to pass and accelerating faster. So I expect you're going to be in great demand here. Thank you so much for coming on and being so generous in sharing your insight once again with our audience.
Thank you, Jonathan. See you next time, no doubt.
Many of you generously contributed to buying a truck, a 4x4 vehicle for the armed forces of Ukraine in our recent marathon fundraiser for Car for Ukraine. That vehicle was delivered thanks to your generosity and refitted in Lviv with life-saving reinforcements, the doors, windows, and the engine area. That vehicle was destroyed a few weeks after it was delivered at the front in a drone attack. All three servicemen survived with only minor scratches and concussion. Your generosity in funding the vehicle was instrumental in saving the lives of all three Ukrainian soldiers. Now we are launching our Christmas Tree Trucks 2025 campaign. The goal is to raise €11,000. So please help us buy another vehicle for one of the most effective Ukrainian brigades on the fourth Christmas of Ukraine's epic fight for survival against an imperialistic and genocidal neighbouring state. Help us celebrate the heroism of the soldiers who have held the line against all the odds, who fight for their freedom and pay a terrible price, while also, incidentally, protecting the freedoms of Europe.